Hey everybody, and welcome to Open Source Tonight. Today I wanted to talk about the importance of open standards. So let's get into that. Full disclosure, I have dealt with some of the standards bodies at conferences and different things that I have done for work purposes before as a software developer. So, you know, they may have rubbed off on me a little bit, so take what I have to say here with a grain of salt. Anyway, let's get into the video. So why is open standards important? Well, with open standards, you have a standard framework, as the name implies, that everything in an industry or in a particular format can be used for interchange. So for example, if me and you both are alerting authorities, we could use the CAP standard to exchange alert messages. Or maybe I'm a podcast receiver and you're a podcast offer. You can offer a podcast and then produce an RSS feed for that podcast that then I can consume and respond to that podcast. And the podcast example is really interesting because for me, one of the reasons I like podcasts is it's a decentralized system. It is a system that's based on standards, and you're not really in a situation where that you are as dependent on third parties. For example, this YouTube video, it's very dependent on YouTube hosting it. Case closed. But that's not the case for my podcast. That I get from a hosting provider, and that server, you know, as long as I, got the thing paid for, I can host the show. Case closed, right? So again, bandwidth is a concern because when we're talking about bandwidth, definitely it costs a little bit of money, but for audio podcasts and the small amount of listeners that I get on the show right now, it's not very expensive. So that's really nice, that it's affordable to get started. But the other thing that's really nice is because that I, in a sense, control more of that platform, it's less in danger of something going wrong that's out of my control. With YouTube, for example, if their system was to remove my channel, I really don't have any recourse. But I do with my own podcast because by definition, I'm the one hosting it anyway. And it's very likely I was the one that caused the problem. So I would like to do a video in the future talking about how to make a podcast, and I hope you'll be staying tuned for that. I'm considering moving away from the system I use now called Podcast Generator. It's a good system, but it's limited in some ways that I would like to, have more control over. So I'm thinking I'll probably just roll my own system. Maybe I'll even open source it. But anyway, that's not what you're here for. The point is, with these open standards, it allows for everybody to be on a level playing field. Right? It allows everybody to be able to use the same communication format, right? It allows everybody to basically work together and have a more open environment. And it's interesting because open standards and open source, while they're not identical things necessarily, they're definitely connected, I would say, in a lot of ways. For example, the TCP implementation, open standard, of course, very much big standard, available in all kinds of open source projects and systems like Linux. And you've got the web, which is an open standard that's based on top of TCP/IP. And if you think about it, there's a lot of standardized things that we use every day from our web browser. That's all standardized how to build a web page, right? So, you don't have a web page be different for Firefox and for Chrome. For the most part, there was a few little edge things. But the thing is, in the early days of the web, which granted I really wasn't around for, I was alive, but I wasn't really browsing the web at that age, or especially building web pages at that age. Back then, there was things that you'd have to put special tags in to get Firefox. Well, it wasn't really Firefox at the time. It was before Firefox. I forget what it's called. Mosaic, I believe is what it was, wasn't it? Something like that. One of the browsers that preceded it that Firefox basically became as the open source build of years later. I should do a video on that. That's a great open source story. But anyway, that, would be different than the way the Internet Explorer had you do something. So if you wanted scrolling text or something, you might say, from what I've heard in the past, have to do it differently depending on the browser. But now that stuff's pretty well standardized, right? So again, standards help everybody because it allows you to say, okay, I made this web page. It should work pretty well everywhere there's a web browser. Again, it's not 100% the case, but like 99.999 or something, for the most part, right? If I put a paragraph tag, for example, and say I want a paragraph to show up on your web browser, it doesn't really matter whether you're using Firefox or Google Chrome, it generally seems to show up the same way, right? It's a paragraph. So that is very powerful that we have those standards to do that. So yeah, this is just a quick video about open standards. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching, and I hope to talk to you again very soon. Goodbye, everybody.